Justin, we're live. Thank you for coming on the show.
Great to be here.
Awesome. Now, Justin, I've had a lot of guests so far, and a lot of them come from finance backgrounds, and they've been in finance for most of their lives, one way or another. But it's rare to see someone who's founded a company, who's built that over a decade, and then who's also decided to become venture capitalist. It's not a very typical breed you see. And so I just want to brief people on your story, and I'm sure you'll tell it even better than I do. But you grew up on a farm in South Africa, decided at a very young age, like myself, that you wanted to be an entrepreneur and build a company. So you built a cybersecurity firm. And from there on, as you were building that firm, you realized there was a lack of seed capital in Africa as a continent and South Africa as well. And so you decided to start 40i as a way to provide that support to entrepreneurs. To my understanding, you're still building the cybersecurity firm as well, right?
Well, not exactly. We actually did a partial exit of that company in 2017, so I still have kind of a bit of a passive shareholding remaining, and I still sit on the board. But I've been full time on the venture capital business that we started since 2009. So yeah, quite a while now that I've kind of focused on the investor side of things.
It's incredible. Before we started this recording, I was talking to one of our Twitter followers, and he was sort of talking about how he's a founder in the position that you were in when you started your cybersecurity firm. He's young, he's got no connections, no like accolades. He doesn't have these fancy degrees, and so he was talking about how his journey and how he's kind of planning and thinking about things. Instead of focusing on fundraising for first few questions, I want to ask you about the cybersecurity firm. First, if you could like tell us about what it was, what it did, and then how did you like grow it in the early days?
Yeah, so it was not easy. So I was inspired to. I quit high school. I was like a year from the end, and I quit anyways because I wanted to become a tech entrepreneur. And that was in basically 1999, 2000, around the time of the original dot-com boom and bust, which was happening mostly in Silicon Valley. Um, and there wasn't a lot of that kind of stuff going on here in Cape Town, where I'm from, um, quite yet. But nevertheless, I thought it was really cool that this idea that young people could start companies and become millionaires and do cool stuff, and it seemed pretty awesome. So I was always interested in technology. I taught myself to code when I was, I think, 9 years old. Um, Even though I did grow up on a farm, I managed to borrow some textbooks from some other kids that were going to university doing computer science, that kind of thing. So yeah, I just kind of always told myself whatever I felt I needed to know. And cybersecurity was just something I was really interested in. I mean, back then it was super early. It wasn't really that much of an industry yet. It was more just a bunch of guys online just hacking systems and chatting to each other. And it just seemed kind of clear to me that this would need to turn into a business and an industry, because more and more companies and people were just getting online and relying on the internet and on technology for everything. And I mean, back then it was still super early days. A lot of people didn't even have an email address yet back then, but it was changing quickly, and I could kind of see that. So to me, the future just looked kind of obvious, and I just felt that cybersecurity would be a natural piggyback trend off the growth of the internet and technology in general, which I guess has proven to be completely true. So I started thinking about ways that I could hitch a ride on that, even though I was far from the epicenter of what was going on in the US. I grew up here in the southern tip of Africa. But we got access to the internet in the mid 90s, and you could just read a whole bunch of stuff online and teach yourself. And yeah, I was just basically on my own. I quit high school and I moved to the city just on my own. And I knew one other person, and that person knew somebody who let me use their garage to start up in. So it's like a cliche today, but I literally did start up in a garage. And I tried a bunch of different things in the cybersecurity space. I mean, I was only like 18 years old, and people didn't really take any of this stuff seriously yet. But I had a few ideas around different security services and products. Tried a few things. Basically, struggled for quite a few years. Really didn't get anywhere. But eventually, I found something that worked, and it was all around. Basically, built an online distribution platform for security software, and I was finding best of breed security products that could be digitally retailed and downloaded off that platform, which was a totally kind of a newish idea back then. Around that time, you would still go to a computer store and buy software in like a cardboard box with a printed manual inside and discs or a CD-ROM, maybe. So digital distribution wasn't a thing yet. So I built this platform myself, and we grew it across like 20 African countries. And yeah, I mean, growing the company from early was super difficult because I didn't really have very much. So I mostly just used opportunistic kind of PR, I guess. I would get hold of journalists and radio stations, just starting small, and I would just offer to provide comment on the latest computer viruses that were spreading at the time or whatever was going on. It was a good time. Around then, early 2000s, there were like these waves of email distributed viruses that kept coming out and taking down banks and computer networks. So it would get in the news a lot, and they were looking for, I guess, comment that was um, suitable for the layperson to understand, taking a technical topic and just making it, learning to speak in sound bites. That was a big thing. And I would just use that praise to just drop in my website whenever I could and just mention it and just offer people free demo downloads and stuff like that. And slowly the traffic just started to grow. Yeah, it was really guerrilla tactics with just no money at all. I was really sitting in a garage with a couple of old PCs I built together and cobbled together, built myself, um, and just started to kind of build out a strategy of being a go-to person and getting my name out there in the press and starting to drive some web traffic.
That is incredible. So you're a high school dropout. You teach yourself how to code at 9 years old. You've moved to the city. You're 18 years old now. You decide, you know what? I'm looking at the future in this space. It's going to become some. So you build this platform where people can sell their, cybersecurity software. People can download it and protect their computers. So you figure out the product side, and then for the distribution, you literally call into radio stations as an expert and from there promote. That is absolutely amazing. I do want to ask you about something though. So you're still young at this point. I mean, when you started this, you're 17, 18 years old and you're looking at the future, you're learning about it. I barely existed in the early 2000s, but I have seen a lot of clips from it. And what it seemed to me is, you'd hear Bill Gates talking. He'd say, everyone's going to have a computer. And people would kind of laugh at that. They're like, what are you talking about? No, no, they're not. Like, you're just an idiot. This is a bubble that's going to burst and you're all going to go away. You're all, the kids that have no idea how the world works. And
Yeah.
I think a lot of founders today, they're trying to find those contrarian things to believe in to an extent to follow in path of founders like yourself. And I think a lot of times there's confusion on like, how do you do that? How do you like bet on these things before they become a thing? So I kind of want to understand what really prompted you to believe that cybersecurity was
Mm.
going to become as important as big as it did? And was it something you heard somewhere? Did you read something? Like, were you just like, looking at the stars one night pondering and just kind of struck you? Or like, how did that happen?
Yeah, it's a really great question. It's an excellent question, and I think one of the best writers on this topic is actually Paul Graham of Y Combinator fame. I don't know if you're familiar with his collection of
Of
essays
course.
online, but he's written extensively about this, and I really agree with a lot of how he thinks about it. And generally, it's just this idea of if you're really deeply interested in something, and let's say you're a passionate geek about something, you probably live and breathe a vision already of how you think things should be. And you're probably like 10 years ahead in your thinking of just the common man. It's something that's sort of obvious to you, but completely not obvious to regular people who are not sitting every day, kind of living this, whatever the space is that interests you. So, like, he often writes about just building the products that you want for yourself, and then in a large extent, I was doing that. Like, I just love cybersecurity. I taught myself how to be a computer hacker. I was on online chat rooms and IRC networks, old school stuff back in the day, with guys all over the world just doing the same kind of thing, and it was just a passion and an interest. And it seemed so obvious to me that this was going to grow, because, like, why wouldn't you want email, and why wouldn't you want the web, and why wouldn't companies leverage these tools to become more efficient and to do business online? Exactly like you say, at the time, companies and people were a bit skeptical, and there were different opinions. But to me, I never thought otherwise. It was just so obvious that the world needed to go that way. And so I just felt, and I guess the problem with this approach is that you're often early, and I was. It took me quite a few years to really find something that kind of bit. And a number of my ideas around this space were just too early. People just didn't see it yet. And it's been like that with a lot of my endeavors since. To me, the trend is pretty clear, but I'm often like a couple of years early, and that's almost as good as being wrong. So yeah, I try to just be very honest with myself about what I really feel is just an unwidely acknowledged truth. I think sometimes when people are trying to create product ideas, they almost convince themselves that a product's a good idea. They're almost selling it to themselves, as opposed to something that is so natural and organic that it's to you just obvious. And actually, you almost assume somebody else has probably done this already, but maybe they haven't, or maybe it's only one or two other guys. And yeah, so to me, it's about that, just kind of this model of truth for the future that you believe is going to be obvious with the passage of time. Come hell or high water, eventually it's going to come to pass.
I think to really sum it up for the audience, that really might be it. Find the things that you're really curious and obsessed about, and as you're learning and as you're obsessing over those things, usually you won't even notice you seeing the future with those things. So it's like anyone can be that, but most people don't allow themselves to be curious and to obsess over these little things and geek out over them. Am I correct in that assumption?
Yeah, and I think if you're truly passionate and interested, you'll already be like a super early adopter of that mindset, whatever it is, without maybe even realizing it. So you might be using cutting edge tools, or just having a mental headspace that other people are just way behind you. And if you just stop and think about it, you're like, wow, what I'm doing now at the edge of this geeky sphere will become mainstream and normal in 5 to 10 years' time. Which was pretty much exactly what Bill Gates was saying in that clip you're talking about. It was considered wild, right? Oh, computers are big things in rooms for corporations. But Bill Gates figured, no, everybody's going to have one on their desk, and it was like crazy. But of course, it's exactly what happened. So it's really just that model over again. And people kind of think that tech, everybody, I think, in the paradigm of today, thinks it kind of stops. They're like, oh, well, we've got everything we could ever need. What more could we need than an iPhone and an iPad and a desktop and whatever it is? But it just never stops. There's always the next thing. There always is. I've been in tech for like 30 years now, and it's still going. So
You mentioned the next thing. I remember being in eighth grade, and at the time, my friend and I were both 13 years old, and GPT-2 had just come out. OpenAI was still, relatively new, relatively unknown. And I remember we were tinkering around with their playground, their very early interface. And I just remember telling all my teachers, like, you guys don't realize all of this stuff is gonna change, and you don't realize how the world's gonna be so different. And I remember I'd even get it to write my essays and write my history presentations, and I just like build these little scrappy things on the side because I was just like, it could do my work, and like I just have to review it and memorize some of these things and I'm done. And teachers obviously didn't know
exactly.
any better, so they're like, oh, you must have written it. So we got away with it back then. I want to ask you, as an investor and as a founder, what are those future things that you're looking at? Obviously, AI is a big part of it, but what are some frontiers that you're seeing right now that are really exciting to you personally?
Yeah, well, the great thing about being an investor is that you don't have to worry too much about that, because that's the founder's jobs to come up with those ideas and then pitch them to you. And you get to see if you can figure out which ones could make it. So I've obviously made the jump from being a founder and building companies to starting a VC firm, and that was inspired just by wanting to invest in other young entrepreneurs who were in my own position. But when I did it, there was no help available, no money. So I wanted to change that. But yeah, I try to not box my thinking too much in terms of what could be. I love seeing what creative ideas people come up with. The thing is that, and the example you just gave was a great one. It speaks to what we were just talking about, where you were exposed to an early version of GPT before anybody else was talking about it, and you were using it already, and you could apply this thinking, right? Like a couple of years later, everybody's using this tool, so that speaks to the point. Um, Now, there are people in all different places in the world, working in all different spaces. They're at the coalface of all different kinds of things, so they see unique things, and that's where ideas sometimes really begin. Someone is working in a mobile phone network company, and they see some inefficiency or some problem, and they think about building a tool to solve it. Now, there's no ways I could know about that, right? Because I'm not at the coal face of all these different industries and verticals and cutting edge tools. Um, so I'm not going to try and predefine what any of that is. I'm going to see what people come out of the woodwork that have been at that coal face and see something, and they're going to bring it to me, and we're going to have take a look together and see, why would this be adopted on a wide basis. So we don't, as investors, this is maybe unusual. A lot of investors will say we do fintech, or we do whatever it is, health tech or something. We don't say that at all. We actually just say we do tech, because we're tech people. Like I said, I've been a coder my whole life. I understand technology, technical things. So what we're looking for is where tech is applied to humanity in a way that is an unknown truth that should become obvious. Now, AI is actually currently the latest buzzword, right? It's the latest super obvious thing, almost now too obvious. People, I think, are jumping a little bit too ahead on it. So it's in a little bit of a hype curve right now. But I can think back. There's been all kinds of hypey, bubbly things like this. I mean, just a little while ago, everybody was talking about gamification and gamifying everything. There's always something new. So yeah, I think AI is super young. Actually, it's got a way to go. Um, there are all kinds of weird niches out there in enterprise software, and here in Africa, it's kind of unique as well. We see some pretty special stuff, because there's kind of a leapfrog that's happened here, where like mobile internet totally just arrived and leapfrogged physical, like fiber optics and copper line networks. So there's like billions of mobile phones with 4G access across the continent of Africa. Yet there's very basic services that are missing. I mean, one of our companies has built a platform that acts like 911, but using an app. Because in many African countries, there is no 911. There's no centralized dispatch service for first responders. So this is a private company that's built a private platform that does exactly that with location-based technology, and you can get an ambulance or a fire truck or whatever you need in a couple minutes instead of like an hour, um, all through an app. So there's just so many different corners of the world and different niches that are out there that I don't really presume to be able to know what they all are.
Yeah. I remember when we were tinkering with GPT-2, we came up with a bunch of ideas. We tried to build this fitness assistant at some point that would like keep you accountable and all this kind of stuff. and we had this growing document every day of different ideas we had and different things we could do. Justin, you strike me as the person who would have the same kind of thing, where you might have like an ideas approach or like an ideas notebook, and you just have like hundreds of pages of these things that you see on a daily basis, but that maybe you just don't have the energy to build, or you don't want to build, or maybe you don't have the founder market fit, whatever it may be, but you still have a lot of those golden ideas. If possible, I'd love to hear some of those if you do have them.
Do you know what? I don't have a notebook at all. I tend to just keep everything in my head. I often feel like the odd one out in a room when everyone's furiously making important looking notes and I don't have anything, and I feel like I must be missing something super important. Um, but yeah, do you know, I do what I do is still the same thing. I look at my own life and I kind of see like, what am I doing today? What am I what's like the trends in my own life? Because I'm typically an early adopter of any new kind of approach. And I do spot things from time to time that I'm like, yeah, I bet you people will be doing this soon. And then in a couple of years' time, yeah, you see it start to happen. Um, I don't have a particular list offhand that I can share. um, one of the verticals that really interests me, that I think is going to grow dramatically for the average person in the next kind of 5 odd years, is the longevity space. Um, there's a there's a startup mentality that's entered the longevity space. This is all about like slowing down aging or reversing aging, but not the kind of bullshitty version. I mean, the real version. And there's a whole trend going on right now that's super under the kind of radar, but that's got real science and real data and real kind of a startup mentality being applied to it. That's super innovative and showing real results. And it's something that like we've invested in a company in this space, and I experiment on my own like body with I take different supplements and try different things that are in this space. And it's exactly that kind of thing that I think it's currently in like this little corner, this little community. It's going to end up way more mainstream. Just give it a couple of years; it's definitely going to happen. And that's just the classic. It's the same model again. There's a bunch of early adopters and geeky types and people who are super intense about it and into biohacking and experimenting. And it's in a corner of the internet somewhere. But at some point, that's going to come out and become more mainstream or more productized, more acceptable to normal people. So I see this kind of mentality almost spreading out into all sorts of different spaces and not just software. So, yeah, that's not really a startup idea, I'm afraid, but it does speak to the overall mindset.
I think any great founder would be able to take that and extrapolate and come up with all these different really cool ideas. I really do appreciate that. I think that's an amazing vertical to even just look at and explore if you're a founder. I was about to say you look quite young. You're telling me you started all the venture capital firm at like 2009. I'm like, there's no way at 2009 you don't look, but I was gonna say in one of your earlier responses, you're talking about sometimes founders just think their idea is so good that they almost convince themselves. And sometimes they don't see that they actually could get it right, but with a different idea. And, sometimes they have to iterate, sometimes they have to pivot. And something you mentioned about your journey was you knew when the time to pivot was, you knew when the time to iterate was. You've had the failures, and when those failures happen, you didn't stick to them and try and make them work. How did you know when to pivot versus persist?
Yeah, man, that is a great question again. This is a tough one because, on the one hand, startups typically are way harder than anyone thinks. Like people think they have a tolerance for pain and misery and suffering, but it's not nearly as high as what they really think. And usually success is like past that point, anyways. So, on the one hand, you need the ability to persevere and stick something out and really go past the point where 99% of people drop out of the race. On the other hand, you need the judgment to know when you're just bashing your head against a brick wall and wasting your time. Um, and that is super tricky. That is not easy at all. And I definitely, when I was young, and I guess I was passionate about the bigger picture, the overall idea of cybersecurity and the internet growing, and wanting to ride on the back of that. But I had a whole bunch of different ideas, and I tried a whole bunch of things. And there were periods of time where I got super discouraged, and like I just had no money, and everything sucked. It was like, but because I dropped out of high school, I didn't have the option to go to college or anything. Like I was kind of stuck with what I'd chosen to do. So in a way, I had to just keep going. Um, and so, kind of on an overarching point of view, that drive and persistence, that perseverance was critical. But within that was knowing when to kind of stop something and try something else, take another turn and see what's down another path. So, yeah, I do think people can get overly fixated because they want something to be a certain way. They believe the world should be like this, but maybe the world isn't actually like that, like for whatever reason. So, there's this balancing act of, yes, the reality distortion field where you see a vision of how things could be versus the ability to take a step back and unemotionally observe and see the world how it really is versus how you wish it was. So what I try to do is to really step into that modality and be like, what do people really like? Oh, they're actually a bit lazy. They're actually a little bit shallow. They're actually a little bit this, a little bit that. What are their real motivators? And often that can really help you to position a product. Like one of the problems that I see is I get what I call toolbox companies come to us. And a toolbox company is where people have built a set of tools or parts that you could fit together in any way you like and build whatever you want. And that's a huge problem because people have no idea what they want. So it might be super powerful and it might be able to do all kinds of things, but people just don't have any creative imagination. So customers, it's the most difficult kind of product to sell. Um, People just want to hear a solution to a problem or something that's going to bring them some obvious benefit. They want it handed to them on a plate. It's the same way that like real estate agents, if they need to sell an empty house, they'll get someone in to decorate it temporarily, so that when someone walks in to view that house, they see a finished product and they're like, "Oh wow, this looks amazing! We'll take it." If they just walked into an empty room, most people couldn't visualize what it looked like, full of furniture and artwork and stuff like that. So yeah, it's a little bit of a tangent, but part of what we try to do as partners and good investors is to help guide people through this and be a little bit of an objective sounding board. So I think people do need to try and build that around themselves, whether it's mentors, angel investors, venture capitalists, whoever it is, people that can help them, on the one hand, encourage them to persevere, on the other hand, help them to see the world through different lenses and evaluate, am I wasting my time here? Are things a little bit different than what I thought? The lean startup mentality is big into this, shipping an MVP, because the minute you ship and start testing in the real world, you see what people actually do versus what you thought they would do. And then you can start that feedback loop, right? So that's another great way to start to learn the realities about your ideas, just to get something out there. I see way too much like ready, aim, 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 never fire, just trying to get something perfect with no feedback loop at all. It's a total waste of time. That's usually going to lead to failure. You need to get out there quickly and get that feedback loop going so you can adjust, pivot, course correct, all those good things.
Absolutely. One of my mentors always used to say the best entrepreneurs and investors alike he knew were the emotional ones, the ones that to a degree were unexcitable, or they didn't necessarily feel distraught when bad things happened, or didn't feel super excited when good things happened. They just kind of took the very analytical and objective lens. And it seems to me
Mm.
like instead of a framework or like specific steps to evaluate an idea, it's really just about, as a founder, if you can just detach yourself for a moment, be unemotional, objectively observe things, that's where you'll see if you need to pivot or persist. And usually the answer will be kind of intuitive. Am I correct in that kind of
Yeah, it's,
summary?
it's definitely it's a component of it. I think it's not an easy thing to do as a founder, though, because you're probably naturally passionate about what you're doing, which is emotive. And so, yeah, I mean, I even had to train myself how to think that way. Coming from an entrepreneurial background, moving into being an investor, I was more emotive, I guess. I'm a more passionate person in general. So I've kind of taught myself how to adopt that level way of thinking. It takes practice. It's not easy. But you make me smile with what you're saying, because I've been in so many meetings where all hell's breaking loose. Companies are in deep shit. Like they're running out of money tomorrow, and we're just calm. We're just like, we're not yelling or anything. It's just a normal part of startup life. We're as calm as, equally when things are going super well, we're like, well, we've seen this and it could also go straight back down again. So we're not going to be calm as well. So yeah, there's definitely an element of learning how to just be level through the ups and the downs without cutting off passion and drive at the knees. And that's where I think having a mentor or a partner or someone who can soundboard can help play that role as kind of a counterfoil to all of that. It's not an easy thing to do. Like, this totally takes practice, and I totally sucked at all of this when I was younger and in the early days as an entrepreneur, and probably dragged on too many ideas way too long, and all those things. It's to be expected.
You mentioned having a mentor and having somebody that can be your soundboard. That helps you be a little more objective because they can then kind of remove you from the passion and be like, listen, you're thinking a little too emotionally here. What are some other ways you mentioned you had to teach yourself how to do that? What are the methods you taught yourself on how to do that internally?
Yeah. So either having a mentor or maybe just having a partner, a co-founder. Everything I've done with co-founders, by the way. And I think that's, if you can find a way to do that with a great person, which is super important, then that's the best way to go. Um, Not to say single founders is a bad thing, it can also be great, but I like doing things in partnerships. So whether it's with a mentor or an angel investor or a co-founder, all of that could work. But yeah, I mean, steps to kind of grow as a person and learn to take command of your own emotions and your own mind, like managing the monkey brain, takes years of practice. I guess for me, like what I've always tried to do is really be an observer of the world around me. So even when I was starting out, I could see that there were like people who did well and then failed, people who like would get super rich but then suck at life. They would end up unhappy, and I was like, well, this is like, I don't want to be that. So let me observe, let me watch and see, what do these people do wrong, what do they do right, and try to apply that just across everything. Like just observe and watch carefully and in a kind of a disengaged way. So all I was interested in was the facts, not what I felt should be the case, just how it is. And the more you observe, the more you can kind of see, all right, people have a way of seeing the world, and then there's the way things really are, and they can be quite different. And there's actually an arbitrage available in that for entrepreneurs. Um, in fact, that's like the best investors in stock markets and so on. That's how they work. They play the emotions of the stock market, and they know that people kind of lurch from one side to the other, um, and they ride that wave. But so yeah, and then once, I think if you're able to then observe the world, then you're able to start observing yourself. And once you're able to detach a little and observe yourself, you'll see when you're getting emotional, and you'll see when am I being driven by my emotions or by my analytical mind here? And then eventually, with a bit of practice, you can kind of take control of that and step back and kind of choose which input you want to pay attention to. So it's like a muscle, I guess. The more you train and practice being able to do that, the more you can just take control of that monkey mind of yours, and pick and choose what inputs and prompts you want to take from it, and how you want to kind of overlay that against how you've observed the world and people to be, and start to make decisions in that way. But it takes time.
Now, Justin, you mentioned two things that I found really interesting. One is you said often people think they can tolerate a lot of stress and misery, but the success often goes past those limits anyway. And the second thing you said is when you were young, you actually dragged out a bunch of ideas that you should have killed early on. I think stories are one of the most powerful lessons. I think we can give advice and we can say what people should do, but the stories are always going to be more impactful. So I'd love to hear those stories of young Justin. He's 18, 19, and the mistakes and the miserable kind of times, and what happened. And I'd love to hear any of
Yeah.
those stories that you've got.
Well, I mean, think about this. Like, I was at a fairly small school, and when I quit, it was like big news. It was like a big deal. Around that time, people didn't quit school and do startups. That was like a crazy thing. So when I quit, it was everybody knew, and it was like a big deal in the community. Now I went off to the city, and my first couple of ideas fell totally flat. And I was like, I had like no money. I was like living off the kindness of other people. So yeah, it could get pretty miserable pretty easily. Like all my friends had gone off to college and having fun, having a good time, and I was like 2 3 years into this with nothing to show. And my ideas had bombed, and I was young, and people didn't take me seriously. And like there was no one else doing tech startups around that time here anyways. I was super kind of alone in what I was doing, so overall it was considered to be nuts. So yeah, I was down some pretty deep dark holes here or there because I kind of didn't have a way out, and this wasn't all going so well. My big plans had kind of amounted to nothing. um, and in a way, as I said, that's kind of forced me to keep going and find something that build on what I learned and figure out. I had to figure out that like my initial ideas weren't going to work because of this or that, and like take some like objectively take some learnings, just be humble about it, forget about your ego, and just be adamant that you're just going to accept those lessons, whether they're tough, whether you don't like them, just accept them, and they're a gift. Use those, use it, build on it, try again, do something different. Let go of, I think we get a little bit attached to things like, oh, I've got an idea, and then your ego takes a bit of a knock if other people don't appreciate your idea, or jump on it. We just have to let go of that and just accept, well, it's just how it is. Let me learn from that. Let me try something else. Let me not get down in the dumps. Nevertheless, you do. And yeah, I do think that, I mean, I see a lot of people get into startups and they think, they talk the talk and they think they have what it takes to push through, but it's so much harder and so much deeper in the hole than what they think. When they get there, they're like, oh my God, like, I think I'm done with this. Particularly because a lot of people have other good, better options or easier options. Maybe they could get a corporate job or they could go to school, whatever. I didn't have those options. I was stuck with my decision, which is great for the best. But yeah, I think it's part of the journey. It's super tough. It's way tougher. From the outside, people don't see it either, and everybody thinks about now that startups and founders have become cool, which they totally were not back then. It's like a rock star thing now, and there's this idea that someone cracks a great idea and overnight they're a billionaire and it all happens kind of quickly, but it's never like that. You go look at the story of Instagram. There's the whole 10 years before Instagram became Instagram and then became a rapid success. um, so you got to get realistic about this stuff and realize that it's part of the journey and that's what it's going to take.
Now, Justin, before I ask you about the moving to the city and the specific stories, because I really do want to get into the specifics of that, because I'm kind of on the same path. I told you I did some very similar, dropped out of high school, and build startups and all this kind of stuff. So that's why I wanted to interview you. I think we're very similar in a lot of regards, but another South African at the time moved, was just like you, and he decided to move to Canada, then to the US, and now his name is Elon Musk.
Yeah.
Now, both of you took a similar approach. You moved to a big city in your country. He decides fly across the pond with $2,000 and tries to make it here in North America. If you're a founder today, you're a young guy like myself, for example, right? You're 18, and you're thinking about and you want to build a company, you want to build a startup. Where should you go? Do you go to the big city in your country? I know your firm is based out of Atlanta and Cape Town, so you've got that US exposure as well. Do you try
Yeah.
and go to the US like a lot of founders do and like, I don't know, crash on some couch in San Francisco. What do you do?
Yeah. Well, when I was starting out, there was only like one answer to that question, and that was you had to go to Silicon Valley. You had to go to San Francisco. That was the epicenter of it all. That was where all the venture capital was, and all the talent, and the right mindset. But obviously, so much has changed since then. And a big part of like why I created the VC firm in the first place was I wanted to be a part of breaking that dominance down and spreading startups globally. Because where we are today, it's just not true anymore, right? You don't have to go to San Francisco. In fact, San Francisco is super saturated, right? Like, and that's why it's so expensive. And you're competing against just so many smart people who are all drawn there. And often there's a lot of groupthink going on there where all the same ideas are kind of going around. And yeah, it's maybe not the smartest place to be at all. So I think, yes, you do need to be close to, let's call it an urban center somewhere, just because you're going to need to access a community, people, talent. You're going to need to find people. You're going to need to find money. You're going to need to find these good things. But I would say there's not a city in the world anymore that doesn't have some kind of startup scene going. It's now just a global thing. It's totally been democratized by cloud computing, open source software. And the general spread in the VC method. So I would start by thinking about the opportunities. One of the reasons Africa is so exciting is because there's a ton of opportunity, but there's not yet a ton of founders or VC money available. So it's kind of wide open. It's not super competitive, and there's a ton of open opportunities that very few people or nobody is looking to service or solve. So I would encourage anybody listening to think about, like, what do you know where you come from? What do you know that other people cannot know because you're from there, or something about that region that maybe others don't, and leverage that as a unique strength. I mean, if we all try to go to the US, we'd all be competing against people who are from the US, know the culture better, know the market better, etc. Funnily enough, though, people from South Africa, the reason we have an Atlanta office is a ton of our companies go to the US and compete very successfully, because people from here they're pretty tough and resilient. They're used to doing more with less. So a lot of our companies build great products for like 1/5 of the funding of a West Coast or East Coast US company, for instance. And we've got a number of companies that have become the category winners in the US against US competitors. So that's another example of taking something that's unique about you and where you come from and going elsewhere with it, like to the US. It doesn't have to be the US, it could be somewhere else. We've got companies that have gone to Latin America, or Europe or Australia, and done well there as well. So it's a very global opportunity space. And so I think what you need to do is figure out what it is that you bring to the table that's a little different, maybe from everybody else, and maybe don't focus on the absolute obvious of Silicon Valley or somewhere like that. Consider other places, other markets, other opportunities that might be less heavily traded or less saturated, and see if maybe there's something in it there.
You actually mentioned some extremely interesting. You said, you know, a lot of times when you're in communities like San Francisco, it actually could lead to a lot of groupthink, which
Yeah,
I've interviewed, a, I've out of everyone I've interviewed, everyone kind of says yes, be in San Francisco, but you're kind of saying it actually could take away some of your unique ideas, and you actually might end up thinking like everybody else, which isn't a good thing if you're building a company. I found that
yeah,
point really interesting. And then I want to ask you about bootstrapping versus fundraising, because now you've got a seed fund and you support a lot of entrepreneurs that were in your position. But back in the day, you kind of had to bootstrap yourself. You had to just figure it out. You couldn't really access a ton of venture capital. If you're a founder today, even if it is easier to access seed funding, even if it is easier to access capital, is it worth accessing it at an early stage? When should you think about fundraising? What do you generally think about this question?
right. Yeah, it's a great question. Yeah, I mean, when I was kind of starting out, there was virtually nothing I was able to raise a tiny amount of angel money when I first got to the city because I needed something. But I mean, we're talking like a couple $1,000 now. It was small, but it was just enough to get by and get started. And then from there, I was eventually able to raise a little bit more. But also, I was like earning little bits of revenue here or there, like doing some consulting and doing some service work and whatever I could to bring in. It was super bootstrapped ultimately. And I think there's a ton of value in that it forces focus and it doesn't indulge the luxury of kind of wasting time, yeah, empire building, spending a ton of money building something that's actually not going to work. It really forces focus, and focus always pays in my experience. And it forces you to be ruthless as well and just really think carefully about all the money, time, and energy you spend and where it's going. Um, so I think there's a lot of healthy aspects to being lightly funded or bootstrapped or just not having a ton of luxury built in. What I've seen is that during various kind of mini bubbles we've had in VC in the last 20 years, there have been a couple of them. Most recently, we had one that kind of came to a halt around 2021. Money became easy to get, and a lot of companies just got too much money too easily, and it actually ruined those companies and wasted those founders' time because it just created too much luxury and indulgence, and they were able to build big teams that became slow and inefficient and inagile. And it also kind of shielded the company from the market feedback that they should have been getting, and kind of getting warning signs about the product earlier and making changes earlier, considering pivots earlier. Instead, you've got money to burn, so you can bumble along. Oh, we're going to find a way to make this product work. And there's like people having meetings about having meetings and PowerPoint slides and stuff like that. Almost always it leads to disaster. It really does, especially in early stage companies. So that really was a problem for me. Like, but the problem was that it was a difficult message to convey. I would say to our founders, like, you guys have got too much money, you're spending it too quickly, and you're building too big a teams. And of course, they didn't want to hear about that, right? Now we'd seen this rodeo a couple times before, but they hadn't. Most founders out here are first timers, and to them, it's like, "What's awesome! Wow, we raised a couple $1 million, and let's go." Problem is, when you've got, I don't know, let's say you have 10 million in the bank, instead of becoming a company that's focused on how to make money, you actually become focused on how to spend money. Because then you take that money and you divide it up and you make budgets and you're like, we allocate it. You're like, right, we're going to spend this on this and this on this. And it becomes about spending money and not about making money. And it's a totally different mindset. And that's when you get middle managers and budget meetings and stuff like that. None of that's relevant to early stage startups that are in the discovery phase. And the discovery phase is all about figuring out what kind of company and product you actually need to be. Because when you start out, you're typically not it. You're not there yet. You have some ideas, but you've got a way to go still. So I think too much funding too early can be super dangerous, more often than not. Funding should really be there to accelerate things that are kind of already showing signs and working, and you just want to pour fuel on the fire. Of course, that's an oversimplification, of course. It's never quite that easy. There's usually lots of good signs and bad signs and everything in between all at once. So it's not that easy. But I do think there's a ton of value in being lean, the kind of focus that brings. And also, like, when you take a ton of people's money and you spend it, now you kind of owe it back to them multiplied by, you know, 10 or 50x in theory. So the more money you take, the bigger of a success story you actually need to build if you want to be successful. And that's kind of intimidating as well. It's way easier to exit for 50 million or 150 million than it is for 1 or 2 billion, I can tell you now. And an early stage VC needs like 50 times their money. And as the guys go up to, Series B guy needs 3, 4, 5 times their money. That's not easy to come up with if it's big numbers, if you've raised 50, 60, 70 million. So yeah, I do think people should, money is a distraction. It can be a false achievement. Like, the celebration of raising money is not a good thing. Like, you should see it as having raised an obligation or a responsibility. It's not a badge of honor in any way. It's not an award. Your idea has not been validated. It just means that some guy somewhere who's building a portfolio of ideas thinks that maybe yours might be one of his 15 or 20 that could work. But if you're one of the 7 or 8 that amount to zero, it doesn't matter to him, but it will matter to you. That's how VCs think. It's different from a founder's perspective.
Absolutely. Well, Justin, we're nearing the 50-minute mark. I've got a billion different questions I could ask you, but obviously I want to be mindful of your time. Is there literally anything that you'd like to add? Any cool stories, anything that you'd want to talk about before we end this off?
Um, well, look, man, I've always just followed what I believe in and done what I kind of am passionate about. So when I was an entrepreneur, I really wanted to just, I wanted the freedom and I wanted to do the things that I enjoyed and um, felt strongly about. And that's what I went and did. And I just kept doing it until it actually paid. And eventually it did pay. And then you know, I was like, well, that was tough because I was a lone entrepreneur. There's no angels, no VCs. So maybe I'm going to do that next and help other guys my age, young guys like me. I was just in my early 20s around then. Started the VC firm when I was 26. So again, that was just starting. It's not just starting a business. It's a business like any other VC firm. Being an entrepreneur, filling a gap again, and doing something that I felt strongly about, which was helping other young entrepreneurs and getting back into startups. Because once my company had become mature, I kind of lost interest because now it was like a mature business. I realized I'm not like a manager. I'm a startup guy. I like the creative process. I like facing those challenges. A mature company's challenges are like day-to-day stuff, like how much leave should people get and vacation time, stuff like that. That didn't interest me. So I got back into startups by becoming an investor, and again, I kind of fiddled my way through it. It was not obvious. It was not clear. It was a new thing for where I live. There was not a lot of like precedent, so we made a ton of mistakes. We initially were just angels investing our own money. Then we were like, let's build a firm and raise money and raise funds. And we did all of that, pioneered a bunch of stuff. But I would say like 9 times out of 10, we basically had no idea what we were doing, but we just had a belief that this is something that should happen. And we should just find a way to make it happen. And I guess I kind of didn't care what people thought about it because usually at the time people didn't think much of whatever it was. Usually people think you're crazy, or often because, as I say, I was often too early with my ideas. Same with the BC stuff. So I guess having a thick skin and being able to just forget about what people think. Like it's great to solicit advice and opinions, but also be quite willing to discard it. I think where I see a lot of founders make mistakes is they just blow in the wind. They get pushed and pulled by whatever today's trend is, or current meme that's out there, or current whatever. Sentiment goes up, sentiment goes down, and they follow that. You just have to stay. We often talk about just looking through the cycle, like just the conviction to just stay level and keep going and look through all of that. Because most people, and particularly humans in crowds, are a bit like sheep. They just kind of lurch around, driven by sentiment, go from one side to the other on the boat, with not too much deep thought about it. So you can't let yourself be affected by that stuff. Find a vision that you believe in and that is truly yourself, not something that you've adopted or picked off the shelf and try to make your own. Like, find something that's truly of you, and you should never work a day really, and naturally find the deep persistence and the thick skin and the energy and the drive that's needed to see it through.